All right, so I thought maybe we'd just kick off with a question that was on my mind. Before doing this and seeing you all, I was kind of curious. I've had discussions before around innovation in newsrooms. And my question is, does innovation really happen in newsrooms, like real innovation? And I mean, whatever that means. But Suman, I'm particularly curious about you. You're working with editors, and the capacity in which you're working is a, data, as a data scientist. And you had told me some stories earlier on about your interaction with them and how it's not necessarily, in your area, it's not the journalists who are coming up with the innovation. It's you coming up with ideas and then them adopting it. And I'd love for you to perhaps talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. I think 2 points fundamentally important here. One is newsrooms scale from the data-philic to the data curious, the data phobic. And so it depends on where on that scale you are. The other thing is betaworks is in a unique position because we often build tools to monitor social media for other products, and then we'll be like, hey, could we use this for Digg to rank their content or to let editors throw out the 90% and pick just the 10% of the best articles that they want to feature. And then we'll just go to the editors and be like, hey, this is something we could do with the data. We could map communities. Is that cool? Do you like it? And they'll be like, yeah, sure, this is great. We could see how a link performs in the Democratic versus Republican communities. And then we'll go and we'll be like, we can also track all the authors, and we can build a leaderboard of authors who are getting most social popularity based on the articles. And they'll be like, no, we don't want that. So it depends a lot on, we take ideas to them, and sometimes they reject it, sometimes they accept it. But it's finally their decision, and the data just helps them in achieving that.
And of course, the examples that Becca showed do sort of manifest that there is innovation happening in newsrooms. Becca, I'd love to ask you about something I touched on at the opening of this panel. I mean, I found that election time, it sounds like every day is election day for you. But election season seems to be a really, really tough time for journalists who are doing specific things such as graphics and visualizations and apps and mapping. And how are you keeping up with all of this? How are you all keeping up with all these skills? And talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so at the Tribune, we have kind of 2 technology teams that work together. We have the News Apps team, which is under editorial, and we do everything from daily map making or helping cover an election to the larger databases that we maintain, like the government salaries database and special features and things like the legislative guide. But we also have a platforms team that helps us build things for elections, like our scoreboard. And so that's a place where you can look at every single race in Texas, and they're embeddable widgets. And because we're a nonprofit, we let anyone use and embed that scoreboard however they want. And so we have these kind of bigger technology pieces, but on a daily basis, in terms of covering the actual news, it's basically just bootstrap reporting in the same way you would anything else. You have kind of templates and things that you make to help yourself prepare, and you learn the skills, and you get things ready as much as you can. But when it comes down to the deadline, you just, hang on tight and do it.
Yeah. Trei, one of the most thumbed up questions here is for you. Could you give an example of an engaging conversation on Quick or WhatsApp?
Yeah, I think. Well, so first of all, I'll just say, just generally, I think there's tons of innovation happening in newsrooms, and with editorial teams, and I think because they understand a lot of the problems to solve and the opportunity of thinking about how to serve the audience, right? The more that they're getting into not just what is the story and pursuing that, but how do they actually reach the audience. And I think increasingly in digital, I think you have newsrooms that are thinking about the audience and thinking about how they're engaging with them. And I think a really great example of messaging services and how news organizations work on them is ProPublica did a really cool thing around I think it was the Charles Taylor project that they did, I guess, with Frontline. And they actually engaged with the community on WhatsApp about sharing content as that was airing on Frontline and the reporting that they had done about kind of a conversation about people who were familiar with that, and they were not just pushing information out as a distribution service, but they were actually taking questions and processing those and sort of answering them. And again, I think conversation is sort of the key there. It's an interesting user interface sort of metaphor to start thinking about when we think about media and we think about engaging the public.
Talia, you showed an example of a quiz as a way of engaging and people actually learning very quickly. And we've seen all kinds of storytelling experiments, from explaining things through graphic novels to data visualizations. One question asks, what is your opinion of sites like BuzzFeed, which mixes cat quizzes with breaking stories, and is that the future? I wonder if you could answer that.
I have heard this before, that perhaps you need, what's the old phrase, like a little ice cream with your vegetables, or however you want to phrase it. I don't think that that's been tested as much as we might want. So why don't we do some sort of research on that to find out, is the ideal mix for some certain target group a little bit of cat video plus a lot of politics? And let's not be so normative about it. Maybe that really is the best that we can do.
And to, sorry, Trei, were you going to add something? And sort of to build on that question.
I like cats.
I like cats. To build on that, what do we know about consumption of news and knowledge transfer?
Yeah, so there's been lots and lots of research, as you might imagine, about how news media can transfer knowledge. And it shows, by and large, if you're consuming news media, you're better informed. But some media out there actually make it more challenging for people with low levels of education to learn. And so I think this a little bit goes back to Kate's point earlier, that you really have to know the target of the media that you're producing. If you're targeting low education individuals, you really have to make an incredible effort to reach that group, because a lot of things that we take for granted at a place like University of Texas are not easily translatable. Like, the level of readability has to be carefully curated. How advanced do people have to be in terms of using the internet in order to navigate your site? And so I would say that there are some technologies out there, the internet and some more complicated sites cannot reach those with lower levels of education because they're just not equipped to handle that information. And so I think targeting maybe is a nice theme from some of the earlier panels.
I just want to say one thing on that, is that when we started doing card stacks, which are kind of in a question and answer format, a lot of people in the media actually made fun of them. And I think a lot of media writes for media, which is, great, whatever. I'm sure they get awards for that. But like, I think that, like, if we're actually trying to educate the public, and we phrase sometimes like 9 questions you're embarrassed to ask about Syria. Like, why are people actually embarrassed to ask them? Because like, they think that they should know them, but like, we write them in a way that is understandable. And I'll tell you, the people we get the most feedback from, which I think is super positive, is educational institutions that are like, hey, can we use these card stacks? We have our students bringing them to us, and we just made them embeddable so that institutions could just plug them into course material. And so I think, like, we should think about our audience and respect them.
Yeah, and Talia, your first bullet point was inform. And I was a little bit shocked and thought, isn't that what journalists do? What's the gap there? Why isn't that happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a gap there in terms of giving journalists the freedom to really think outside of the box and present information in really new ways. I think we have some really inventive newsrooms that are giving journalists the freedom to do that, several of which are represented here. But I think in a lot of day-to-day newsrooms, it's get that story out, write it in the inverted pyramid, get the AP up on the website. And I just think we have to critically rethink the way that we're informing the public and really test what works and what doesn't. And it might be very different for different topics and different audiences. But if we're not testing it, we could just be putting stuff out there that doesn't help anyone at all.
Becca, do you have any examples of formats you've tried to convey something that's particularly dry or boring and make it interesting?
Yeah, we actually are coming up on the 3rd edition of our series, 31 Days, 31 Ways, which is in the month of August after a legislative session. We do a story a day on the ways that the laws are going to change come September 1st. And we try and make this a very, very multimedia and kind of experimental story format kind of series. So we're doing lots of flowcharts and quizzes and graphics and interactive infographics and other kinds of things on stories that we might not normally do, like that now hairdressers can work at weddings. You know, this is like a simple law change, but it actually affects a lot of people. Or that officers are now going to get training on how not to shoot dogs, which is pretty important. So things like that are, you know, tailored to a different audience than our traditional insider audience, and it's giving us a format to kind of play around with these different kinds of formats and ideas.
I have a question for the group, whoever wants to answer, but perhaps you all have some insight. How are you addressing different members of your audience in terms of diversity in the electorate? What are things you're doing to target the diversity of your audience? I don't know how you do it with your algorithm.
Well, it's sort of, I don't think it's really that hard if you just know what people say on the internet, and like essentially they're giving you all the information based on their profiles and their tweets, for example. And so once you know the divide, you sort of can understand which articles will be better adopted or better received in certain communities versus other. And there's two sides to that. One is, do you just want to feed them the same thing, which like kind of locks them up in the filter bubble? On the other side is, do you want to like introduce diversity at certain points of time so that they get like sort of a serendipitous idea into what else exists out there? So yeah, we have a product called Scale Model, actually, which is another betaworks product, and if you give it a bunch of keywords, it'll just find you communities on the internet, and we can like serve them to any of the other companies, including digg.
Right, and I wonder too, how is this affecting the way you're recruiting in your newsrooms? Are you?
I was going to say that's the first thing you should do. I think like, and I think so many newsrooms have so much work to do, ourselves included. Like, and we've been, you know, for. Actually, I think at ISOJ last year, the first question that was asked of my CEO on the stage during the keynote was about diversity. And we were already underway on that, but now have been making a lot of progress. But I think I think we're nowhere close to where we really need to be to address like the things that people are really interested in by reflecting the diversity of our audience in our newsroom, so that we're covering the topics that matter to you know, to a wide range of people, and then, you know, making sure that we're listening to our audience about, you know, what we're missing, and, you know, and how we're covering it, and use that as like a constructive feedback loop. That's one type of diversity. To go a little bit like not as you know, important. In sports, we actually cover each team individually, so that you get the diversity of opinion about like the Astros. Only Astros fans are talking to them, and only Yankees fans talking to them. So, you know, we're also building communities of interest that are passionate around topics to have that feedback loop to make sure that we're covering it well, you know, in that way as well.
So we have another question on messaging. I think you hit on something that's on people's minds. So if a lot of news moves to messaging, do we think companies like Snapchat have any facility with journalistic values and standards that we may expect of a news organization?
I think, here's the deal. I mean, this is an interesting time for media. I mean, we are really in the ecosystem is evolving dramatically right now. And I think there's a couple different ways that we could go about this. Like, we could freak out and retreat, or we could think about how we robustly engage with the technology platforms where the user behavior has migrated to, and think about how we have really good conversations, right? And the way that we've been thinking about this is that, you know, the way that those relationships are set up today is that the technology platforms come to us and they say, you're a publisher, so you know about content, and, you know, we obviously understand product and technology way better than you, so you're going to bring us the content and we're going to do the product, and then we'll, you know, that will be the arrangement. But I think in digital media, a company like ours, for example, like, we actually do understand product. We actually do understand data. We actually do understand and have been working through for, you know, some time how you know, the principles that are important about how you engage with your audience, how you inform them, the moral questions that you have. We've actually been wrestling with that in digital media and technology, and we have that to bring to the conversation as well. So what we're trying to do is say, like, look, like, let's engage in that conversation, not just bringing you some content, but let's actually bring you some like understanding of how this stuff works, right? That's an important skill and understanding that we have. And we understand our audience around content better than you will, right? They may understand their users and their product, but they don't These platforms are looking for and eager to have these conversations. We just need to be more forward about them instead of kind of retreating. That's my opinion, but. You know.
Thanks. Does anybody else have anything to say? Okay.
And one last thing on messaging. We talk about the apps, but there's also opportunity for us to just think about designing the way that we interface our services this way, right? We can build our own apps in this mindset. We can, you know, there was a project that I saw that was based around text messaging earlier around elections. Like, we've been, actually in politics, we were doing SMS stuff for years. And interestingly, it turns out that text box on SMS on the phone is a pretty killer app on mobile, right? In terms of like sending information. And you can now start to send multimedia responses back, whether that's video or images or other things that kick off. And there's platforms like even Facebook Messenger that allow you to open up your own app out of that messaging platform as like kind of calls to action. So I think, you know, this is, as we really are embracing mobile, it's going to be a really important thing for us not to just think about like how do we engage on those apps, but how do we actually think about creating our content and our services that way.
Well, we're kind of out of time, but I am going to squeeze in one more question. And I think there's a lot of hope and optimism in this room, and this morning's presentation's manifestation of that. All of those projects, I wonder if each of you could give us a quick glimpse into what something you're working on that you're really hopeful will engage and inform your audience, your community.
You go first.
So we're trying to bring in analytics more into our projects and actually do some testing on user engagement with particular features. So I'm really excited about that because it can inform the way we decide to design and format and tell these stories so that we can have, you know, more feedback from our users.
I think Digg is building something called Digg Dialogue, where the stories they feature on the front page, they're going to have the writers come and do an AMA with the audiences on Digg, so that people can like directly talk to the writer and like get perspectives on like and ask questions about ideas and not like the race and stuff like that, which we heard earlier.
And Engaging News Project is working with 2 different major news organizations to do some really cool experimentation in their comment sections to try to see if we can make that space better and more engaging for people.
I want to talk about something really boring. You know what I'm excited about is like on the web we have to figure out advertising if we want like these news organizations to persist. And it turns out like revenue is a big part of the business model, and like this is something that we've been working on for some time. These are issues at the heart of advertising are issues around privacy, around performance, around trust. And because so many of us in media technology have ignored it and not talked about it as part of future media conversations, it means that it's spun out of control, and now it's threatening what we do in terms of building our own platforms and our own the open web. And I'll just say it again: like if we care about the democracy of the democratization of media through the web, then you should be caring about the models that support that, and advertising is ours, so I care a lot about it. So that's one of the things that we've been working a lot on, is how to make that stuff work better for users. So
great. Well, thank you, and let's go toast all of you, and Woody might even sing a song.